The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the red dirt and scattered sagebrush. Sarah Walking Bear pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak tree, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give away her hiding spot. Behind her, crouched in the tall grass, 4 other Apache girls trembled in terror as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Just hours earlier, they had been laughing and gathering wild berries near their village when the attack came without warning. A group of cavalry soldiers had descended upon their peaceful settlement like a swarm of angry hornets, their rifles blazing and their voices shouting orders that meant nothing but death to the Apache people. Sarah remembered the screaming, the terrible, piercing screams of her mother as soldiers dragged her from their family lodge. She remembered her father's desperate attempt to reach them before a bullet found its mark, sending him crashing to the ground in a pool of crimson. Most of all, she remembered the way her younger sister Maria had looked at her with those wide, trusting eyes as Sarah grabbed her hand and ran. Now Maria sat beside her, only 12 years old, with tears streaming silently down her dusty cheeks. Next to Maria was Elena, 15, and usually the bravest among them, but now shaking like a leaf in the wind. Behind the tree trunk, Anna and Isabella huddled together, both 14 and inseparable since childhood, their traditional Apache dresses torn and stained from their desperate flight through the thorny desert. The horses were getting closer. Sarah could hear the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather saddles. She closed her eyes and tried to think of what her grandfather would have done. He had been a warrior, a man who knew the desert like his own heartbeat and could disappear into the landscape like morning mist. But Sarah was just 16, and all the warrior training in the world seemed useless when facing the thunderous approach of armed men bent on revenge. "They killed everyone," Maria whispered, so quietly that Sarah had to lean close to hear her. "Papa, Mama, little Carlos, everyone." Sarah placed a gentle hand over her sister's mouth, knowing that even the smallest sound could mean their death. The 5 girls had managed to escape the massacre only because they had been far from the main part of the village when the attack began. Now they were alone in a hostile world that seemed determined to erase their very existence. The sound of horses stopped. Sarah held her breath, listening to the terrifying silence that followed. Then came the voices, rough and speaking in the language of the white soldiers. "Check behind those rocks over there, Murphy. I saw movement." "Ain't nothing but jackrabbits, Lieutenant. We've been chasing shadows all morning. These Apache kids are slippery as snakes. Could be hiding anywhere. The colonel wants them found, and by God, we're going to find them." Sarah felt ice water flowing through her veins. They were hunting them specifically. This was not just a random patrol stumbling upon their hiding place. Someone had given orders to track down any survivors from their village, and these soldiers would not give up easily. The girls remained frozen as the sound of boots crunched through the dry grass nearby. Sarah could smell the sweat and tobacco from the men, could hear their heavy breathing as they searched. One set of footsteps came so close that she could see the shadow of a man's hat brim fall across the ground just inches from where they hid. "Lieutenant, we ain't got all day. The sun's getting higher, and this desert heat will cook us alive if we stay out here much longer. 5 more minutes, Murphy. Then we head back to the fort." Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Sarah's legs cramped from crouching in the same position, but she dared not move. Maria's breathing became so rapid that Sarah worried her sister might faint. Elena had bitten her lip so hard to keep from crying that blood trickled down her chin. Finally, mercifully, the voices began to fade. "Nothing here, Lieutenant. These desert rats probably scattered to the 4 winds by now." "Maybe, but they can't hide forever. This territory belongs to the United States now, and there's no place for hostiles who won't accept that fact." The sound of horses returned, but this time moving away from their hiding spot. Sarah forced herself to count slowly to 100 before she dared to peek around the tree trunk. The patrol was riding toward the horizon, their figures growing smaller against the vast expanse of desert sky. But their relief was short-lived. As the immediate danger passed, the full weight of their situation crashed down upon them like a rock slide. They were 5 young Apache girls, alone in the desert, with no food, no water, and no idea where they could find safety. Every ranch, every town, every outpost in the territory would be hostile to them. They were truly on their own. "What do we do now?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at the 4 faces turned toward her, all waiting for her to provide answers she did not have. As the oldest, they naturally looked to her for leadership, but she felt as lost and frightened as any of them. "We need water first," she finally said, forcing her voice to sound more confident than she felt. "There's a creek about 2 miles north of here. If we can reach it before dark, we can drink and refill the water pouches." It was not much of a plan, but it was something. The 5 girls emerged from their hiding place like cautious deer, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Beautiful in its harsh way, but unforgiving to those unprepared for its challenges. They walked in single file, Sarah leading the way, with each girl stepping carefully in the footsteps of the one ahead. This was an old Apache technique for hiding their numbers and making their trail harder to follow. Every few minutes, Sarah would stop and listen, searching for any sound that might indicate pursuit. The sun climbed higher, turning the air shimmering and brutal. Their mouths became dry as sand, and their traditional Apache moccasins, perfect for moving silently through the desert, offered little protection against the scorching ground. Maria stumbled several times, her young body struggling with exhaustion and grief. When they finally reached the creek, it was little more than a trickle of muddy water between 2 banks of cracked earth. But it was water, and they fell to their knees gratefully, cupping the precious liquid in their hands and drinking deeply. They filled their small water pouches and splashed the cool creek water on their faces, washing away some of the dust and tears. "This won't last long," Elena observed, looking at the weak flow of the creek. "The drought has been bad this year." Sarah nodded grimly. She knew Elena was right. Even this meager water source might dry up completely within days. They needed to find a more reliable source of water, but that would mean traveling closer to areas where white settlers might spot them. As the day wore on, their situation became increasingly desperate. The small amount of dried meat they had managed to grab during their escape was gone by midday. Their water pouches, small to begin with, were nearly empty again by late afternoon. Worst of all, they could see smoke rising from several directions on the horizon, indicating ranches and settlements that represented both potential sources of help and almost certain death. The girls found temporary shelter that evening in a small cave formed by fallen rocks, but none of them slept well. Every sound in the night, from the howl of a coyote to the rustle of wind through the brush, made them start awake in terror. They took turns keeping watch, though what they could do if discovered was unclear. By the second day, their situation had become critical. Maria was showing signs of severe dehydration, her lips cracked and her skin hot to the touch. Isabella had cut her foot on a sharp rock, and the wound was beginning to show signs of infection. Anna had developed a fever that made her shiver despite the desert heat. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. These girls were depending on her to keep them alive, but she was failing them. Every decision seemed to lead them deeper into danger. They could not stay hidden forever without food and water, but emerging from hiding meant almost certain capture or death. On the 3rd day, their worst fears were realized. A new patrol found their trail near the dried-up creek bed. This time, the soldiers were accompanied by Apache scouts who had been forced to work for the cavalry. These men knew the desert as well as any Apache and could read sign that white soldiers would miss entirely. The 5 girls ran desperately through the burning desert, their strength nearly spent, their hope almost gone. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. They stumbled over rocks, tore their clothes on thorny bushes, and pushed their exhausted bodies beyond all reasonable limits. Finally, Sarah could run no further. Her vision blurred from heat and exhaustion. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the ground. One by one, the other girls fell beside her, their young bodies simply unable to continue. The soldiers surrounded them with rifles drawn, their faces showing no mercy for the exhausted children at their feet. The Apache scouts looked ashamed but said nothing. They had their own families to protect and had made their choice long ago. "Well, well," said the patrol leader, a grizzled sergeant with cruel eyes. "Looks like we found our little runaways. Colonel's going to be pleased." Sarah struggled to her feet, placing herself between the soldiers and the younger girls. Even in defeat, some part of her refused to surrender completely. "Take me," she said in halting English. "Let others go. I am leader." The sergeant laughed coldly. "Sorry, missy, but that ain't how this works. You're all coming with us, and the colonel will decide what happens next." They were bound with rough rope that cut into their wrists and forced to walk miles back to the cavalry fort under the blazing sun. Maria collapsed twice and had to be carried. Isabella's infected foot left a trail of blood in the sand. But they were alive, for now, though none of them knew if that was a blessing or a curse. Fort Davidson stood like a brown scar against the red desert landscape, its wooden walls and watchtowers casting harsh shadows in the afternoon sun. Sarah and the other 4 Apache girls were dragged through the main gate as soldiers and civilians gathered to stare at them with hostile curiosity. Some spat in the dust at their feet, others muttered angry words about savage children who needed to learn their place. Colonel Harrison was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter ice. He stood on the porch of his quarters, smoking a cigar and watching the girls being brought before him with the detached interest of someone examining livestock at market. "So these are our little runaways," he said, blowing smoke into the hot air. 5 Apache girls who thought they could hide in my territory." Sarah lifted her chin defiantly, meeting the colonel's gaze despite her fear. Her grandfather had taught her that even in defeat, an Apache should show no weakness to their enemies. "You killed our families," she said in careful English. "We run because you murder innocent people." The colonel's face darkened. "Your people attacked our supply wagons and killed good soldiers. What happened to your village was justice, girl. Justice for every white man, woman, and child your warriors butchered." "We attack no one," Sarah protested. "We live peaceful, grow corn, hunt rabbit. We hurt nobody." "All Apaches are the same," Colonel Harrison replied coldly. "Hostile savages who refuse to accept civilization. But don't worry, we're going to teach you the error of your ways." The girls were thrown into a storage shed that had been converted into a makeshift prison. The building was stifling hot during the day and freezing cold at night, with only thin blankets for comfort. They were given barely enough food and water to survive, usually just stale bread and a cup of murky water twice a day. Days passed in misery and uncertainty. Maria grew weaker from lack of proper food, her young body unable to cope with the harsh conditions. Isabella's foot infection worsened until she could barely walk. Anna's fever came and went in waves that left her delirious and calling out for her dead mother. Sarah tried to keep their spirits up by telling traditional Apache stories in whispered voices, but hope was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. Through the small window in their prison, they could see soldiers preparing some kind of wooden structure in the center of the fort's courtyard. Whatever it was, the men worked on it with grim purpose. On the 5th day of their captivity, a young soldier named Private Johnson brought their meager breakfast. He was different from the others, younger and with kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her cousin who had died in the attack. When he set down their food, he lingered for a moment. "I'm sorry about this," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "This ain't right what they're planning to do to you girls." "What they plan?" Sarah asked urgently. Private Johnson's face went pale. "They're building gallows. The colonel says you're going to hang tomorrow at dawn as an example to other hostile tribes. Says it will show them what happens to Apache who refuse to surrender." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected prison, maybe forced relocation to one of the reservation camps, but not execution. They were children, barely more than babies, and yet these men planned to murder them in cold blood. "Please," she whispered to Private Johnson, "help us. We are innocent. We did nothing wrong." The young soldier looked torn, his conscience clearly battling with his fear of military discipline. "I can't," he said finally. "I'm sorry, but I just can't. They'd court-martial me, maybe hang me too for treason." That night, the 5 girls huddled together in their prison, trying to comfort each other in their final hours. Maria cried quietly for her parents, while Elena held her and sang an old Apache lullaby their grandmother used to sing. Anna and Isabella sat close together, whispering prayers to the spirits of their ancestors. Sarah felt completely helpless. She was supposed to protect these girls, to find a way to save them, but there seemed to be no escape from their fate. The walls of the storage shed were thick logs. The door was barred from the outside, and armed guards patrolled the area constantly. As dawn approached, they could hear activity in the courtyard. Soldiers shouting orders, the sound of wood being tested for strength, the shuffle of feet as people gathered to watch the execution. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for death, hoping that her spirit would find peace with her ancestors in the afterlife. The door to their prison creaked open just as the first rays of sunlight appeared over the fort walls. Colonel Harrison stood there with several soldiers, his face showing no emotion as he looked at the 5 terrified girls. "Time to go," he said simply. They were dragged from their prison and across the courtyard toward the wooden gallows that now dominated the center of the fort. Sarah could see soldiers lining the walls, civilians from nearby settlements, and even some Apache scouts who had been forced to watch as a warning about the cost of defiance. The 5 girls were made to stand on wooden boxes beneath rope nooses that swayed slightly in the morning breeze. Sarah found herself in the middle, with Maria on one side and Elena on the other, while Anna and Isabella flanked them at the ends. Their hands were bound behind their backs, and their legs were tied at the ankles. Colonel Harrison stepped forward to address the crowd that had gathered to witness their execution. "Let this be a lesson to all Apache tribes in this territory," he called out in a voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "The United States Army will not tolerate hostile action against our citizens and soldiers. These 5 girls are representatives of a savage people who refuse to embrace civilization and peace. Their deaths today will serve as a warning to others who might consider following the same path." Sarah looked out over the faces in the crowd and saw only hatred and bloodlust. These people had convinced themselves that killing children was somehow noble, that murder was justice. She thought of her grandfather's stories about the old days when Apache and white people had sometimes lived in peace, trading and sharing the vast desert. Those days seemed like ancient history now. The executioner, a large man with a black hood covering his face, moved behind each girl to check the nooses. Sarah felt the rough rope against her neck and struggled not to panic. Beside her, Maria was sobbing softly, while Elena stared straight ahead with the dignity of a true Apache warrior. "Any last words?" Colonel Harrison asked, mockingly. Sarah lifted her head and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard. "We forgive you," she said. "Apache people know that hatred makes hearts sick. We die with clean spirits, but you live with blood on hands forever." Some of the soldiers shifted uncomfortably at her words, but Colonel Harrison's face remained cold. He nodded to the executioner, who moved toward the lever that would release the platforms beneath their feet. The silence in the courtyard was complete. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath as the executioner's hand reached for the lever. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her parents, of running through the desert with her sister, of peaceful mornings in their village before the world went mad with violence. The executioner's hand touched the lever. And then, like thunder rolling across the desert, came the sound of galloping horses approaching the fort at breakneck speed. Everyone turned to look toward the main gate as a lone rider came charging through, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. The man was clearly a rancher, dressed in dusty work clothes and wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice booming across the courtyard. "Stop this madness right now!" Colonel Harrison's face turned red with anger. "Who dares interrupt a military execution? Guards, arrest that man!" But the rancher had already dismounted and was striding across the courtyard with the confidence of someone used to command. As he got closer, Sarah could see that he was a big man with weathered hands and eyes the color of the desert sky. There was something about him that reminded her of her grandfather, a quiet strength that came from years of surviving in a harsh land. "I'm Thomas McCready," the rancher announced, removing his hat to reveal gray hair and a face lined by sun and wind. "I own the Cross M Ranch, and I'm here to claim these girls under territorial law." Colonel Harrison looked confused and angry. "What law? These are prisoners of war, condemned for hostile actions against the United States." McCready pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "This is a writ of habeas corpus, signed by Territorial Judge William Crawford in Phoenix. It demands the immediate release of these 5 Apache girls into my custody pending a proper legal hearing." "This is military jurisdiction," Colonel Harrison protested. "Civilian law has no authority here." "Read the writ, Colonel," McCready said calmly. "Judge Crawford specifically addresses military jurisdiction. These girls are minors who have committed no crime that has been proven in any court of law. You're about to murder 5 children based on nothing but prejudice and hatred." The crowd began to murmur, some supporting the colonel, others seeming uncertain about the legal issues being raised. Sarah found herself holding her breath, afraid to hope that this stranger might actually be able to save them. Colonel Harrison snatched the paper and read it quickly, his face growing darker with each line. Finally, he looked up at McCready with pure hatred in his eyes. "Even if this document is legitimate, what possible interest could you have in these Apache children? They're enemies of everything you stand for as a white man in this territory." McCready's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath his calm tone. "My interest is justice, Colonel, something that seems to be in short supply around here lately." The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Soldiers fingered their weapons nervously, civilians whispered among themselves, and the 5 Apache girls stood frozen on their boxes, afraid to move and break whatever spell was protecting them. Colonel Harrison crumpled the writ in his fist. "Legal documents can be forged, McCready. How do I know this isn't some elaborate deception?" "Because Judge Crawford is expecting a telegram from you within the hour, confirming that you've complied with his order," McCready replied, "and because half the territorial legislature in Phoenix knows about this case. If these girls die today, there will be a federal investigation that will end your career and probably put you in federal prison." Sarah could see the calculation in Colonel Harrison's eyes. He clearly wanted to proceed with the execution, but the legal and political risks were mounting. Finally, with visible reluctance, he gestured to his soldiers. "Cut them down," he ordered through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over, McCready, not by a long shot." Sarah felt the rough rope being lifted from her neck, and for a moment she thought she might collapse from relief. Her legs shook as soldiers cut the bonds around her ankles and helped her down from the wooden box. Around her, the other girls were similarly freed, all of them trembling and crying as the reality of their rescue sank in. Thomas McCready approached them with gentle movements, like someone trying not to frighten wild animals. His eyes were kind as he looked at each girl, taking in their poor condition and obvious suffering. "It's all right now," he said softly, speaking in careful Apache that showed he had learned at least some of their language. "You're safe. No one is going to hurt you anymore." Colonel Harrison stormed over, his face twisted with rage. "Don't think this is finished, McCready. I'll have federal marshals here within a week to take these hostiles back into military custody. Your legal tricks won't work forever." McCready turned to face the colonel, and Sarah saw something dangerous flash in his blue eyes. "You just tried to murder 5 children in cold blood, Harrison. If I were you, I'd be worrying about my own legal troubles instead of making threats. Those aren't children. They're Apache savages," Colonel Harrison spat. "Their people killed my men, attacked our supply trains, burned out honest settlers. They deserve everything they get." "These specific girls attacked your supply trains?" McCready asked quietly. "A 12-year-old child and 4 teenagers somehow organized military raids against your cavalry?" Colonel Harrison's face reddened further. "They're all the same. Apache is Apache. And apparently human decency is in short supply among some cavalry officers," McCready replied coldly. He turned away from the colonel as if dismissing him and focused his attention on the girls. Sarah found her voice, speaking in English despite her exhaustion. "Why you help us? You don't know us." McCready's expression softened. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need a reason beyond it being right. But if you must know, I had a daughter once. She would have been about your age." Something in his voice told Sarah not to ask what had happened to his daughter. Instead, she nodded gratefully and helped support Maria, who was barely able to stand after days of poor food and water. McCready had brought a wagon to the fort, clearly planning ahead for this rescue. He helped each girl climb into the back, where he had laid out blankets and provided fresh water and food. Sarah had never tasted anything as wonderful as the clean water from his canteen or the bread and dried beef he offered them. As they prepared to leave Fort Davidson, Colonel Harrison made one final attempt to assert his authority. "I'm ordering you to leave those prisoners here, McCready. This is still a military installation, and I won't have civilian interference with military justice." McCready climbed onto the wagon's driving bench and picked up the reins. "Your military justice was about to hang 5 innocent children, Colonel. I think I'll take my chances with civilian courts instead." The wagon rolled out of Fort Davidson with an escort of nervous soldiers who followed them to the territorial boundary. Sarah watched the wooden walls and guard towers disappear behind them, hardly able to believe they were finally free of that horrible place. The Cross M Ranch was a 2-day journey through some of the most beautiful desert country Sarah had ever seen. McCready drove carefully, stopping frequently to let the girls rest and drink water. He had brought medical supplies and did his best to treat Isabella's infected foot and Anna's lingering fever. On the first night, they camped beside a small stream where cottonwood trees provided shade, and the sound of running water helped ease the girls' nerves. McCready built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and cornbread that tasted like a feast after their near starvation at the fort. "Why you live alone?" Elena asked him as they sat around the campfire. Her English was better than the others, and she had become something of a translator for the group. McCready stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "My wife and daughter died 3 years ago. Cholera epidemic swept through the territory. Lost a lot of good people that summer." "I am sorry," Sarah said quietly. "We know about losing family." "Yes, I imagine you do," McCready replied. "Too much dying in this territory lately. Too much hatred between people who ought to be able to live in peace." That night, Sarah slept better than she had since the attack on her village. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly safe. McCready took the first watch, his rifle across his knees as he listened to the desert sounds and watched for any sign of pursuit. The Cross M Ranch sat in a valley between two mesas, with a good well and fertile fields irrigated by an underground spring. The ranch house was built of adobe and timber, large enough to be comfortable but not ostentatious. There were barns and corrals, a vegetable garden, and fruit trees that provided shade in the yard. McCready had a small crew of Mexican and Apache workers who helped him run cattle and grow crops. They welcomed the 5 girls without question, seeming to understand that their boss was a man who did not make casual decisions about whom to trust. "You can stay here as long as you need," McCready told them as he showed them to a bunkhouse that he had quickly converted into living quarters for them. "I know this isn't your home, but it's safe, and you'll have food and water and medical care." Over the following weeks, the girls slowly began to heal both physically and emotionally. Isabella's foot infection cleared up with proper medicine and rest. Anna's fever broke, and her strength returned with good food and clean water. Maria, the youngest, gradually stopped having nightmares about the attack on their village. McCready proved to be a kind and patient guardian. He never pressured them to abandon their Apache traditions or language, and he even encouraged them to maintain their cultural practices. He provided them with materials to make traditional crafts and allowed them to gather desert plants for food and medicine, as their grandmothers had taught them. Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial leader of the group, helping to translate between the girls and McCready's ranch hands, and making decisions about their daily routines. McCready often consulted with her about practical matters, treating her with a respect she had rarely experienced from white people. "You have wisdom beyond your years," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. "Your people should be proud of the young woman you're becoming." "My people are dead," Sarah replied quietly. "No," McCready said firmly. "Your people live in you and in those other girls. As long as you remember their teachings and their love, they're not truly gone." The legal situation remained complicated. Colonel Harrison had indeed sent federal marshals to reclaim the girls, but McCready's connections in the territorial government proved stronger than the colonel's military influence. Judge Crawford ruled that the girls could remain at the ranch pending a full investigation into the circumstances of their village's destruction. That investigation, when it finally occurred, revealed that Sarah had been telling the truth all along. Her village had been peaceful, with no involvement in the raids that had triggered the cavalry attack. They had been victims of mistaken identity and military incompetence, innocent people caught up in a cycle of violence they had played no part in creating. The revelation led to Colonel Harrison's removal from command and a formal apology from the territorial governor. But apologies could not bring back the dead or erase the trauma the girls had suffered. As autumn turned to winter, McCready made an unexpected announcement. He had been in correspondence with Apache leaders on the San Carlos reservation, and they had agreed to accept the 5 girls into their community if that was what they chose. "I want you to know you have options," he told them as they gathered in his living room one evening. "You can stay here as long as you want. This ranch will always be your home if you need it. But you can also join your people on the reservation, where you'll be with other Apache families." Sarah translated for the others, and they spent long hours discussing their choices. Elena and Anna decided they wanted to try life on the reservation, hoping to reconnect with distant relatives who might have survived other attacks. Isabella chose to remain at the ranch, where she had found work helping McCready's housekeeper and discovered a talent for cooking. Maria looked to her older sister for guidance. "What do you think, Sarah? What would Mama and Papa want us to do?" Sarah considered carefully before answering. "I think they would want us to choose what makes us happy and keeps us safe. For me, I want to stay here for now. McCready has been kind to us, and this place feels peaceful." And so the 5 Apache girls who had once hung on the verge of death chose different paths for their futures. Elena and Anna traveled to the San Carlos reservation with McCready's blessing and a promise that they could always return to the ranch if needed. Isabella remained to help run the household and learn new skills that might serve her well in the changing world. Sarah and Maria stayed at the Cross M Ranch, where they became part of McCready's extended family. Sarah learned to read and write English while maintaining her Apache language and traditions. Maria grew stronger and happier, her natural curiosity about the world returning as she felt safe to be a child again. Years later, when Sarah had grown into a young woman, she would often sit on the porch in the evenings and remember that terrible morning when death had seemed certain. She would think about the randomness of fate that had brought Thomas McCready riding into their lives at exactly the right moment, and she would feel grateful not just for her life, but for the lesson that even in the darkest times, there were still people willing to stand up for what was right. McCready never asked for gratitude or recognition for what he had done. He seemed to consider their rescue simply part of being a decent human being in a world that sometimes forgot the value of decency. But Sarah knew that without his courage and determination, 5 young Apache lives would have been snuffed out for no reason beyond prejudice and fear. The Cross M Ranch became a place where 2 cultures learned to coexist with mutual respect and understanding. McCready learned Apache customs and language, while the girls acquired skills that would help them navigate the changing American West. It was not the life any of them had planned, but it was a good life, built on the foundation of one man's decision that justice mattered more than popular opinion. In time, Sarah would marry one of McCready's Apache ranch hands and raise children of her own in the valley between the mesas. She would tell them stories of their Apache heritage and also of the white rancher who had risked everything to save 5 girls from an unjust death. It became a story passed down through generations, a reminder that heroes sometimes come from unexpected places, and that courage is often found in ordinary people who simply refuse to look the other way when faced with evil. The 5 Apache girls who had once been left hanging to die became women who lived full and meaningful lives. Their survival a testament to the power of one person's decision to do what was right, regardless of the cost.